2014 Canadian Fallen Firefighters Memorial Ceremony that pays tribute to the over 1,100 firefighters who have lost their lives in the line of duty. And whereas the Bridgewater Firemen's Band was presented with a volunteer award on April the 7th, 2014 at the Nova Scotia Volunteer Awards ceremony in Halifax. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Bridgewater Firemen's Band for their award and wish them well at the ceremony in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 3:07. We'll conclude at 4:07. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Last night, at their spring dinner, Halifax Chamber of Commerce President Francis Ferris called for an all-party task force to oversee implementation of the Ivany Report. This was, of course, a recommendation of the Ivany Report, and we have some sense that the task force is coming. So I'd just like to ask the Premier, when will the Premier be calling this group together?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Leader of the Opposition has said, there will be some movement on this file. I'm pleased to say that the Leader of the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia and the Leader of the Democratic Party of Nova Scotia have agreed to sit on a committee which will include members of the business community, members of the academia, and, Mr. Speaker, members from all sectors across this province to ensure that we now move towards the implementation phase of the Ivany Commission, and quite frankly do what I believe was all Nova Scotians want us to do, which is put aside partisan politics.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. Mr. Speaker, the Ivany Report has 19 goals to turn our economy around, to get our financial house in order, to encourage more Nova Scotians to move here and be part of our great province. I've asked the Premier previously to enact those goals in law, as is also a recommendation of the Ivany Report, so that all of us in this House have a chance to vote on something positive together. Mr. Speaker, enshrining the Ivany goals in law would be another good step along with the creation of the task force, so I will ask the Premier on this last day, possibly, of this session, will he reconsider that other Ivany recommendation and agree to enshrine the Ivany goals in law?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I actually believe we had something positive that we could all vote on. It was called the budget, Mr. Speaker, which focused on so many Nova Scotians. I think one of the things, Mr. Speaker, you gotta appreciate the member from Cape Breton Centre, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do want to go back to the question, though, if I may, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, the spirit to which the Ivany Report was focused on was talking about providing opportunities, Mr. Speaker, for young people to stay in this province. Our investment in research grants provides that. Investment or broadening the apprenticeship opportunity is allowing that to happen in this province, Mr. Speaker. If you've gone through the spring session, government is working towards getting its own fiscal house in order. There's been some tough challenges, tough decisions taken by the members of this caucus, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that they've been able to show the people of this province that not only are we focused on today, but we're focused well into the future, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, I'm very pleased that the members of the Ivany Commission have been encouraged by the steps this government has taken.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not taking credit for this line, but I do want to get it on the record. The budget certainly is the Irony Report and not the Ivany Report, because far from doing what the Ivany Report recommended, which was to get our financial house in order, the budget adds another $500 million to our debt, doing the opposite of what Ivany recommended. It proceeds another $1 billion over the life of this government when the Ivany Report said to get our debt in line, and it finds new ways to send young graduates away from our province, the exact opposite. No wonder that the member for Cape Breton Centre has labelled it the Irony Report when it comes to the budget. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to be cooperative today, so I will ask the Premier in my last question this. It has been reported at his own address to the Halifax Chamber of Commerce that there would be two recommendations that the government would not be following through on. One is legislating the Ivany report in law, and I guess we know the answer to that, and the other is creating an all-party committee to oversee progress. The Premier said at that time he wouldn't be creating an all-party committee, and I'll table that. So I would just like to ask the Premier, in light of that, and also the fact that he said in that same article that the place to work together is in the legislature. Well, we see how that's been going recently. Apparently the Premier has changed his mind, which is a good thing in this case, and I'd like to ask the Premier why he's changed his mind and agreed now to create an all-party task force.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been encouraged by the support that I've been receiving from so many Nova Scotians about the direction this government has been going. Speaker, I want to tell you there are so many Nova Scotians who want to be part of continuing to move forward, to generate a positive direction, Mr. Speaker, in moving this province forward. I want to tell the leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of the Democratic Party, I am very pleased the fact that they have both agreed to be part of that committee. I'm looking forward to having it go forward. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the results. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with Nova Scotians because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, it will be Nova Scotians that will continue to drive the spirit of the Ivany report going forward, and I'm looking forward to that.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, today the Chronicle Herald is reporting that Nova Scotia will need to hire several thousand nurses over the next 10 years to avoid a nursing shortage. And this was a message that nurses at Capital Health tried to tell the Premier just 1 month ago when they went on strike in order to secure nurse-to-patient ratios that would improve patient safety. But as we all know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier wasn't interested in listening to the nurses' legitimate concerns. Instead, he argued that Nova Scotia had more nurses for our population than the national average, saying, and I quote, "The question becomes, what more do nurses want? How much above the national average does Nova Scotia have to become before the union is satisfied?" So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, when hundreds of Nova Scotians protested at Province House and spoke at law amendments asking the Liberal government to hire more nurses, why didn't the Premier listen?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was following the lead of one of the former health ministers under the former government, Mr. Speaker, who did not implement the same policy that they're now advocating for in opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the statistics, the health minister didn't seem too worried about the impending nursing shortage. He told the Chronicle Herald yesterday that he thinks we'll be in great shape, Mr. Speaker, and that's a direct quote. But this isn't what young nurses are saying. They say the elimination of things like the graduate retention rebate and the passage of Bill 37 are forcing them to look for work elsewhere. As one young nurse told CTV, "I work in ICU, and our manager is actually worried about an outflux of people who are leaving at the moment, most of whom are young, recent graduate nurses." So my question to the Premier, how does taking away the collective bargaining rights of nurses and the elimination of programs like the graduate retention rebate place Nova Scotia in great shape to attract and retain more nurses in the coming years?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first of all correct part of the question that came from the leader of the Democratic Party. We did not take away the right to strike, Mr. Speaker, from healthcare workers. What we did is we ensured that there's a level of essential services in this province so that Nova Scotia patients, Mr. Speaker, will know that there will be services in place that they can rely on. And if there seems to be labor disruption after that, they can then take on a strike, Mr. Speaker, unlike the former New Democratic government who stripped away the right to strike from paramedics in this province. There's only one, Mr. Speaker, there's only one party in this House who's taken away the right to strike from paramedics, and there's only one other party in this House who wants to take it away from every healthcare worker. This party has stood beside to ensure that we have essential service legislation in place while protecting workers' right to strike. Mr. Speaker, I further want to remind the leader of the Democratic Party that the Minister of Health is continuing to work with Nova Scotians, continuing to provide great leadership on this file, continuing to make sure that we move away from an administrative-focused healthcare system to one that is focused on patients, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased to tell the member that we've now reached a number of 83% of nurses who are working in this province, Mr. Speaker, stay in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe those were statistics that were achieved under the previous government and the previous ministers, Mr. Speaker. So I thank the Premier for the compliment. Mr. Speaker, in the Liberal platform, the Premier makes a commitment to support nurses. And I say it's pretty clear from nurses that once again the Liberals haven't delivered as advertised on another election promise. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier: why does he think threatening nurses with punishment, ignoring their concerns about patient safety, taking away their rights in the fair collective bargaining process, and throwing on top of them a massive tax increase is being supportive to young nurses?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, a tax increase, that's kind of ironic considering the former Minister of Finance who raised the HST in this province. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of ironic coming from a Minister of Finance and from a government that continue to write blank checks across this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on October 8th, Nova Scotians took the blank checkbook away from that party, and we understand exactly why. Mr. Speaker, I also want to remind this House it was under the NDP that $500,000 was taken out of the nurses' strategy. This government is going to continue to work and ensure the Nova Scotians nurses stay and work in this province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Blue Nose 2 project is millions of dollars and 2 years overdue. In a recent South Shore Now news article, the member for Lunenburg said, "I have spent a great deal of time collecting information on the rebuild delays and cost overruns." She added, "It has taken a considerable amount of time to compile this information and is an ongoing piece of my constituency work." Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Communities, Heritage and Culture. Has the member for Lunenburg shared the information she collected about the overruns and delays with him, and has she shared the sources of this information with him?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for the question across the floor. Mr. Speaker, the member of Lunenburg and I have had a few conversations about what's going on down in Lunenburg. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the iconic Blue Nose 2 has been called a cathedral among sailing ships, yet sadly, she is tied to the dock without usable steering equipment. The original contract provided a 43% markup on materials and labor costs of $62 an hour during a regular shift and $93 an hour for overtime. My question to the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage is, can he guarantee to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia that no markup costs or overtime labor will be added to the fixing of the failing rudder? And will he provide the taxpayers with a full and public update on the costs associated with fixing the rudder this spring?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was mentioned in November, as was mentioned last month, and I continue to tell everyone, and I will reiterate that. The Auditor General will make public all those concerns when this project is finished and he has done his review.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the province has announced that the Auditor General will review the project after its completion. With no end in sight, no spending limits, no time for it to sail, the builders quite literally are now looking at basically inventing the wheel. My question to the minister, does he still think the best way to protect taxpayers' dollars is to review a project after it has spun completely out of control, or will he call on the Auditor General to review this project now?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will tell you that the answer to that is no.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I'm going to continue on the same one for a few moments, if you don't mind. Today, the government announced a test drive of the Blue Nose 2. You think they were trying out an F-150, or, God forbid, try out a Lada? I mean, we're going to get stuck with something that doesn't work at all. The Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. I know the Minister of Transportation doesn't remember the Ladas, but they weren't much good, I can tell you. You were lucky if you had any heat. We've decided that we need to take the The Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage said today, we have decided that we need to take Blue Nose 2 on a test drive before sea trials. That's the first thing we've said. Yet on Thursday, April 17th, the same minister told this House twice, and I'll table the Hansard, that the Blue Nose 2 was already under sea trial. So that's number 2. I said, Mr. Speaker, if you want the quote, as we stated in the past, the vessel is currently under dock and sea trials. And the third thing that the quote says, what I am saying to you is that we're still going through those dock and sea trials. So how can the boat be in sea trials on April 17th if today the minister announced a pre-sea trial or a test drive? So my question to the minister, will he please correct his answers to the House? And if he didn't get the sea trials question right, what other answers should Nova Scotia's question? So, you know, which one's right? Is it the first one? Is it the second one? Is it the third one? Just clarify what we're doing now.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will state to the member across the floor that, first of all, you know, being the minister who has received something that both parties across the floor began, and we have to try to correct and fix all that was done prior. I would suggest to the member that he would look at what I had said. I said it was in dock and sea trials, which accommodates to both the ship being there and being looked at. Everything that is being done currently is to correct any issues that we are addressing from past mistakes. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
All right, well, let's line up one of your mistakes. The 2014 Doers and Dreamers Travel Guide has hit the shelves, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, not everything in it is quite factual. On page 81 of the guide, and I will table, the province describes, let me say, page 81, sail on the iconic Blue Nose 2. Blue Nose 2 and Lunenburg breathe the salty air aboard the Nova Scotia world-famous sailing ambassador Blue Nose 2, recently restored in the Lunenburg waterfront. I'll let you have that one too if you want to have a look at it. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, as the lead on this project, does he think that it's okay to speak in past tense and publicly declare that the boat has been recently restored?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, I thank you for that question. However, I, as the Minister for Communities, Culture and Heritage, have not made that statement that he is claiming that was made. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
I don't know, maybe the Minister of Communities of Economic Development and Tourism should take it up because it's in his document that he printed. Maybe I will. So I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I think it may be premature for people to invite people to breathe salty air on a boat with failing steering equipment. Mr. Speaker, the solid steel rudder weighing several tons is just the latest problem in a long line of delays and cost overruns. The shipbuilders are now speaking out against the original rudder design. Taxpayers are already on the hook for $110,000 for the rudder, and some estimates say that the cost could climb to over $500,000. So my question to the minister is, what is the new rudder going to cost, and how long is it going to take before people can breathe the salty air aboard the Blue Nose 2?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my colleague across the floor, first of all, I'd like to state that there are a lot of rumors, and to stand up in the House to speak on the rumors, I don't appreciate. First of all, the rudder is not being remodeled or fixed or taken out and being redone. That's not the statement. We are going through tests. We are going to ensure that Nova Scotians. We are.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage has the floor.
We are going to ensure that Nova Scotians get to enjoy their famous sailing ambassador again. Also, that during the test, we will correct any of the issues that seem to be out there in the media. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Speaker, earlier this week, the Minister of Health told reporters that his preference is to have one union representing all nurses in this province, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Minister of Health went a little further, saying that he would prefer healthcare workers not vote on which union should represent them. No, Mr. Speaker, he wouldn't want to have that democratic right, Mr. Speaker. What he would prefer to do is that government introduce legislation this fall to decide which union represents each health care worker. And I will table that story, Mr. Speaker. So through you to the Minister of Labour is this, Mr. Speaker. When does she plan to introduce such legislation dictating which union will represent which health care worker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question, I think. Just to be clear, I have had no conversations with the Minister of Health on this particular subject, and I have no plans to introduce any such legislation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
So, Mr. Speaker, they're not only rudderless on the Blue Nose, but they're rudderless on the labour issues. So Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has some odd ideas about labour relations. Taking away the right to choose which union represents you in the workplace is another one of these musings by the ne'er-do-well minister, Mr. Speaker. And what this does, Speaker, it really destabilizes the workforce within the healthcare system. So I want to ask the minister once again, through you, if the minister shares the views of the ministers of health, and should they decide which union should represent which healthcare workers at the bargaining table, then when will these public consultations begin?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, there are no consultations planned because there is no legislation of this kind planned either. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have a Lone Ranger apparently in that cabinet, Mr. Speaker, who's making musings, and he's making it up as he goes, apparently, Mr. Speaker. Now, look, Mr. Speaker, this is not things that this caucus is saying. We've tabled the musings, if you will, of the minister, and it's not like someone on the backbench had said this. This is someone that's a member of the Executive Council. That should carry, even with that government, a fair amount of weight. So, Mr. Speaker, the last time the Liberals amalgamated District Health Authority, there were runoff elections, healthcare sector unions were left in flux, Mr. Speaker. Labour police was broken up. Now, The Minister of Natural Resources is chirping in now, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre has a question, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize to the Minister of Natural Resources because his shy, retiring type would never say something like that from the benches. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask just a very simple question. Is why would the Minister of Health say this if he wasn't contemplating it? And why would this government then not respect the rights of healthcare workers to choose which union they want to belong to?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government will respect the desires of the healthcare union members and which union they want to belong. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Regulation for weighing the 3,800-pound Volvo air suspension truck has become quite an issue in Nova Scotia. These new trucks allow for a significantly lower impact on fuel consumption. The Volvo air truck actually gets 9.5 miles per gallon, while a regular fleet truck would only get 8.2. Up to approximately $16,000 a year is in the savings cost for gas, and obviously leaving a lesser carbon footprint as well. The problem is that when these trucks go into the weighing stations, they are not weighed properly because of the distribution of weight. I'm wondering if the minister will explain why the delay is in moving forward with making changes to accommodate these new environmentally friendly trucks.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I've had brief conversations with vehicle compliance with respect to the issues surrounding this particular vehicle, and I don't have the specifics as to why we haven't ironed out those details yet. It seems like something that's an administrative fix and something that's certainly causing significant headaches to small businesses that the member opposite represents. So I'll give the member my word that I'll check on that immediately and see if we can find updates, and I'd be happy to report to her office with the findings. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for his answer. According to some contacts that we've had within your department, there has been a briefing on this issue in the month of January. Also, over a month ago, the owner of King Freight Lines, Rolly McDonald, had a conference that he attended with a member, I believe, from the department as well, Mike Balsam, and Mr. Balsam indicated that he would be getting hold of Mr. McDonald in the near future to discuss the changes that would be taking place. He still has not received any contact from Mr. Balsam, so I'm wondering if the minister himself would follow up by calling Mr. McDonald to provide him with an update, maybe in the next week or two.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I haven't had those conversations with respect to the specifics. If the member wants to provide me with that number, I'd be happy to call him. No problem. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank the minister. And I'd like to thank the minister for that. I know Mr. McDonald will really appreciate that. The system of these trucks to redistribute about 1,200 kilograms when needed, so like when they're on a hill or in a slippery non-traction situation, they adjust their weight so that it's safer. So it's obviously making our roads safer as well. And as I mentioned, they're more efficient and literally will save thousands of dollars every year. King Freight in Pictou West employs over 100 people, and they have over 80 trucks on the road. They will probably have to lay off people due to the recent Michelin situation, and which is very unfortunate. And just yesterday, once again, at Kelly's Lake weighing station, where he finds he's fined most often, he was fined again yesterday. King Freight has no problem in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, or traveling into the States, and the fine yesterday was close to $300. So what I'm hoping is if to where he pays taxes and he lives here and he wants to keep his businesses here in Nova Scotia. I'm hoping that the minister will please make this unfortunate situation a top priority, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss it with Mr. McDonald, and more importantly, so that Mr. McDonald can keep his trucks on the road. And
does the member have a question?
Sorry. I just want to confirm once again that he will ensure that Mr. McDonald will not have to take these 2 trucks off the road that are $150,000.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. There's a number of issues with respect to the fleet under the Trucking Association, and my department and my office itself is scheduling a meeting with the Trucking Association. There are a number of issues that I think we have to get up to speed with as a department, as a government. Long combination vehicles are one of those. Wide-base tires are another. This issue with this particular piece of the fleet for our Nova Scotia trucking industry. So I certainly, we're going to endeavour to get up to speed on those. If there's any advantage we can give to the private sector, Mr. Speaker, we'll take every opportunity to do that. So we're certainly going to move in that direction as quickly as we can. And again, with specifics to this file, I'd be happy to speak with the gentleman and see what we can do. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. In 2000, Nova Scotia had 30% of its population who smoked, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 14 years, that number has declined to 20%, but has recently plateaued. This means we have work to do, Mr. Speaker. In 2011, the government released a revised tobacco-free Nova Scotia strategy with realistic targets that will benefit all Nova Scotians, including decreased tobacco use for all age categories, more public awareness, and more community action. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will the Minister update Nova Scotians on the progress of the latest tobacco-free Nova Scotia strategy that was released in 2011?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. He raises a very, very important public health issue because we have made great strides in Nova Scotia in reducing smoking through the Tobacco Act and also the Smoke-Free Places Act. And we are now, of course, taking a look at possible legislation for the coming fall around working to make even further reductions. And I know that releasing again where we are in relation to the strategy and what needs to be done, that will be part of our early fall plan.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Evidence from the Canadian Cancer Society shows that Nova Scotians, in particular our youth, Mr. Speaker, are facing another fight with tobacco companies with the distribution of flavoured tobacco products, cigarillas and flavoured water pipe tobacco. 49% of Atlantic Canadian high school youth have used tobacco in the last 30 days, Mr. Speaker, have used flavoured tobacco also, which is concerning. Our Nova Scotia youth are still 6% above the national average for those reporting having smoked a cigarette in the last 30 days, and 5% above the national average for those having smoked menthol, sorry. I hope they don't smoke menthol cigarettes, Mr. Speaker. So I'm wondering if the Minister could be specific on the actions he has taken to reduce these numbers.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And he does point out really an alarming now trending towards flavoured tobacco, hookah, and the e-cigarette, this whole area. The department, in fact, will be providing an update next week on this whole issue as we plan for the fall. But also, getting back to a strong education program is, I think, critically important as well. It's been a combination of legislation and education that helped Nova Scotia reach the reduced about 10% in our population over the last number of years. So flavoured tobacco is very much top of mind in the Department of Health and Wellness.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the federal government passed legislation in 2010 prohibiting use of certain products, the experts feel it doesn't go far enough, and there are a number of loopholes in that legislation, Mr. Speaker. In an article on December 5th, 2013 in the New Glasgow News, the minister said that he hoped to have legislation in the spring session of the legislature. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that the House is winding down and there's no legislation on the order paper. So I'd like to ask the minister through you, when will the minister commit to taking the advice of the experts and amend the legislation and close the loopholes that the experts have identified?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite is exactly right. The provinces, in fact, have often taken a lead in terms of both whether it's legislation or whether it's waiting for Health Canada. And Nova Scotia has been a leader in reducing the use of tobacco products, and now we are about to embark on making further improvement, and in the fall we'll be prepared to bring legislation forward.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. I believe the department name has changed. They keep changing them so much, but the Minister knows who he is. I know that. So, Mr. Speaker, Halifax Water has imposed a new fee on residents living in suburban and rural areas. The ditch tax, as it has become known, has hundreds of residents upset. I know all members have received a letter from David Barrett, owner of Barrett Lumber in Beaverbank. And his business is facing an increase of $6,000 in the company's water bill next year. Mr. Barrett has written a letter, of course, to us all. My question is, the Minister had any communication with Mr. Barrett and other residents about the issue?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I acknowledge the question from my colleague in opposition. I too have the correspondence from Mr. Barrett and have been involved in some discussion around the fee charged by Halifax Water. The area of responsibility falls within Halifax Regional Municipality, and as we speak, are permitting HRM officials to follow through with the process for which they're responsible.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it certainly makes sense. I mean, it is a municipal issue, but at the same time, we know that people do contact us from time to time about issues related to other levels of government, and I know members opposite certainly champion causes that may be related to the federal government sometimes. They even bring them forth here in the legislature. So my question for the Minister, given that many residents are dealing with the cost of the ditch tax, does the Minister plan to keep his eye on this and to perhaps get involved if the response isn't to the liking of people here in HRM?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my colleague. The circumstances that we're speaking to, obviously very conscious of the anxiety and concern that it's causing homeowners. As I indicated earlier, I'm privy not only to the correspondence of Mr. Barrett, but the concerns of a number of residents within HRM, and certainly will continue to monitor the process and stay abreast of this matter as it goes forward.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
My final question, a bit more specific. One of Mr. Barrett's requests surrounded the transparency and operating habits of the Halifax water utility. And I know, Mr. Speaker, here in the province, when there's a matter like that, oftentimes we would have the Auditor General review the operations. Has the Minister considered speaking with HRM about having their auditor examine the operations of Halifax Water to ensure that it is providing services at the least cost possible for the residents of HRM?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank my colleague for the question. The administration of the Halifax Water Commission, as I indicated earlier, is a responsibility of HRM. And at that municipal government level, certainly have the utmost respect in their ability not only to be transparent, but to bear in mind the concerns of homeowners and ratepayers. We will continue to monitor the situation through the staff and contact with HRM staff where there's an excellent dialogue. We'll continue along those lines and certainly monitor as we go forward.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is for the Minister of Health. When Nova Scotia's first mental health and addiction strategy was tabled by the now leader of the NDP, it was a hopeful day for people in our province. The strategy was developed by experts who stressed all of the recommendations were interconnected, and in order for the strategy to be effective, all of the recommendations needed to be adopted as a package, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what is the Minister's plan to ensure all of the mental health and addiction strategy recommendations are fully implemented, and who will oversee this plan?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Sackville-Cobequid. Mental health and mental health issues and the strategy, of course, Together We Can, is a very, very valuable contribution to where we will go in the next number of years. We're now down to, I think, about 5 or 6 of those recommendations that will need to still be implemented. And we know that the department continues to make sure that all will be implemented, as well as those that maybe partially to date are being implemented. We do have some lead areas. Just yesterday, we held the first national conference on peer support. Again, another first for Nova Scotia in the mental health field. And I can assure the member opposite that this is a very, very important issue and topic to our government, and we will continue to implement the strategy as well as the recommendations of Dr. Janet Davison for adolescent mental health.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of access to mental health support in communities for families continue to be a challenge. We've learned from past experiences that adding more clinicians doesn't address the issue of access. So I'd like to ask the Minister, Mr. Speaker, what is the Minister's plan to improve access to psychiatric services for people across the province in the communities where they live?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we now have shorter wait lists in many of the districts across the province for mental health, psychiatric services. And I'm pleased to say that our peer support program, our clinical follow-up, has really seen significant improvement. And that's a journey that those who suffer from mental health have some major requirements. Often there is not a cure, but if we can assist in recovery and have access in the community to those providers, then we have strengthened the mental health response in this province, and will continue to go in that direction.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to hear that we're seeing those shorter wait lists and that the work in previous years, Mr. Speaker, is paying off. Mr. Speaker, compassion fatigue is another serious challenge facing healthcare providers here in Nova Scotia and across the country. That includes nurses, doctors, paramedics, and especially mental health clinicians, Mr. Speaker. So I'm wondering if the Minister could indicate what steps the Minister is taking to address compassion fatigue and ensure the well-being of the healthcare providers Nova Scotians depend on.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite raises a very, very important question because sometimes the provider, the deliverer of mental health services also needs the kind of support and I guess a break from those kinds of demands. As one of the areas that we've made, I think, significant improvement upon is having a greater support system across the province. Our community health boards are working on a program, the mental health toolkit, the mental health first aid, and that kind of help is actually reducing some of that burden that has been solely placed at one time on those that are our primary mental health clinicians. And I think as we move further in this direction, I think we'll have a stronger community-based support system that in fact will alleviate that extreme workload that many of our clinicians have traditionally had.
The honourable member for Hants East.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as this House knows, impaired driving legislation is very near and dear to me, especially since this May is the 10th anniversary of my son Bruce's death at the hands of an impaired driver. In my former life as president of MAD Canada, I lobbied governments across Canada for better legislation, including one that asks drivers to have a zero blood alcohol content for the first 5 years of driving. There is no question that this is valuable legislation because it will save lives, because it keeps new drivers separated from alcohol for those first 5 years of driving. In 2007, I was thrilled when the then Conservative government of Nova Scotia introduced and passed Bill 168 that allowed this to happen. MAD Canada praised the government of the day for this measure with a national press release and furthermore awarded them a higher rating in a national document that rated all the provinces on their legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, that's as far as the legislation got. It has never been enforced. When it came to that government, it was about getting the press, taking the credit, and not saving lives on our highway. In 2009, we asked the new government of the day, the NDP government, to enforce the 2007 legislation, and again waited 4 years for it to happen. Again, road safety was not a priority. Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Transportation Minister. Through you, will this government finally put the youth and safety of our motorists first and enforce Bill number 168 from 2007?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. It takes a lot of courage for her to stand in her place and ask questions of this nature, and she's driven by the memory of her son Bruce and her time at MAD, and I know that she wants to make meaningful changes in this province. I was really surprised to learn when I asked these questions initially upon joining the department why this wasn't proclaimed. There isn't really an answer, and I'm surprised to know that things can pass through this legislature and not actually come into law 7 years later. So we are making steps to enact that legislation. We're moving very quickly on that. We're working with our counterparts in Justice and Municipal Affairs to make that happen, Mr. Speaker. We will work on that legislation. We're aiming to have it at fall. Not only that some of the components that the member mentioned, we're going to reintroduce those, and we're going to even make stiffer penalties and increase some of the impaired driving legislation that will strengthen our system. And it won't be this minister, Mr. Speaker, and it won't be this government. It'll be that member that'll drive those changes, as we're going to rely on her to lead the way. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for his answer. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, as people know, Nova Scotia Power is a monopoly. Customers do not have a choice to go to another company should they be unhappy with their service. This is why it is important that there is an oversight of NSP as it ensures that they are providing quality service. This oversight is especially important to ensuring that the electricity bills sent to customers are accurate. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, can the Minister provide details on if there is a mechanism in place to ensure that Nova Scotia Power is accurately calculating the electric bills sent to its customers?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Actually, I think it's a good question because over the years I've had a number of complaints from residents on this very issue. And in fact, there is a mechanism in place. I don't want to stand here and say that it can't be improved because I think it probably can be, but there is a mechanism through the Utility and Review Board. It's actually the identical process for municipal water bills that are regulated through the board. It is a bit of a cumbersome process. I say that right up front, and it's one that I think begs looking at and potentially improving.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. And I think there are a few individuals who have contacted us that would thank him for that answer as well. Matt Garland of Bedeck received his latest electricity bill, and he noticed something wasn't just right. His efficiency Nova Scotia charge increased nearly 120% from the bill prior, yet he used less electricity, and I'll table those power bills. He called Nova Scotia Power about it. They didn't give him an answer immediately, but then later they admitted it was an error and his bill will be adjusted. And I've had several calls since then that there are other people in the area had a similar issues with others reporting it and wondering what's going on. So my question to the Minister was, does the Minister have an explanation as to how this could have happened? And is the onus on the ratepayer to ensure that NSP is accurately charging the individuals?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess there's a couple of issues there. First of all, I'm sure his constituent will be happy that the government has taken the efficiency charge off his bill, so he will be one less charge he's got to watch. It's just too bad the Conservatives didn't vote in favour of taking that off as well. But there's a couple of elements here, because I think it's actually a serious. Because, Mr. Speaker, in fairness, I actually think it's a serious issue, because I think probably a lot of people actually look at their bill and probably don't pay as close attention to that. There are two issues. One, the meters are not always read. Sometimes they're estimated, and there's actually a way, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but there's a mark on the bill that will tell you whether it's a month that it was estimated or whether it was actually read, and they do true-ups. I can find out exactly what that is, what that mark is. I remember seeing it on my own bill. Then there is also somebody at Nova Scotia Power who is designated to deal with those kind of issues and have it come out and read again if there is an issue. And I've also heard issues from some residents where there ended up actually being a faulty meter. So those are usually the three most common issues that can result in that. Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's fair to the resident, and I'm certainly happy to look at if they don't get resolution through the designated person at Nova Scotia Power. I know our office is very happy to make inquiries on that constituent's behalf as well.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his final supplementary.
Oh, thank you. And the Minister's answer is very reasonable, I think. But I guess the very fact that he used less power and is getting charged more tax on the efficiency thing is something that really was something that would bother him. And you're right. I don't think that a lot of people take a look at it maybe as closely as that. The amount charged per kilowatt hour for the Efficiency Nova Scotia program is not clearly listed on the bill, and yes, that's going to be coming off at some point. This inaccuracy on Mr. Garland's bill highlights the importance of reviewing bills as they come in, and that's something that we should be talking to all our ratepayers about and our constituents. But it's unfortunate it seems that the onus is on the ratepayers to correct the mistakes of Nova Scotia Power. While I recognize the government plans to hide the charge entirely come next year, the time being that rate should be clearly displayed until that happens. So my question to the Minister is, has the Minister had any conversation with Nova Scotia Power about the transparency of its bills, including whether the efficiency Nova Scotia calculation rate should be displayed. Anyone that's paying a bill to Nova Scotia Power or any other utility should know exactly what they're paying for, and I wonder if the minister will make sure that there is transparency in the bills that they are paying.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just reading the bill very quick, the two bills very quickly, so I'm you know, my initial thing that I notice is that the first bill crosses a period of December 13th to February 14th, and there was both an Efficiency Nova Scotia rate increase in that period, and there were, before the next bill, and there was also a Nova Scotia Power rate increase of 3%. But that being said, of course, the member is correct that, you know, it goes from basically $6 to $12 for the Efficiency Nova Scotia charge. At the end of the day, he's absolutely correct. There is a certain amount of onus that's on customers to look at their bills, whether it's Nova Scotia Power or Sobeys or wherever else. But when these issues are found, they need to be brought, and I'm perfectly happy if they're brought to my attention or my department's attention, because we will look into them. One of the things that we've done with the new efficiency legislation, since the member asked about that, is that the charges that people pay are audited and published through the board and so forth annually, so they will be completely transparent. Not only transparent, but they will be audited by independent auditors in a manner that people will know not only what they're paying for that, but will know what they're paying for other fuel types as well. But I'm certainly happy to also look into this one specifically. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, today is the deadline to have studded tyres off your vehicles. The weather has been cold later in the season than usual. Mechanic shops are backed up due to the weather. And Mr. Speaker, one shop in my area didn't take its first snow tyre off until late into February. It was actually on the 17th or 18th of April, sorry. They're now booking a week in advance to get studded tyres off of cars. So my question is, what step has the Minister taken to ensure driver safety is a top priority?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the member is asking about studded tyres and the duration of the season for which they have to be removed. And I've got a little bit of good news, but I'll allow my colleague, who's is so diligent on these issues, to answer the question. So I'd like to turn it over to the Minister of Municipal Affairs.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. Just this Saturday, I was in and had my tyres rotated and spoke to the staff, and they shared the very same concerns that the member has shared today, acknowledging that the weather itself, the period of winter, was extended longer than normal, God knows, and the backup that this has created in those service centres for these tyre rotations or tyre exchange. What I will share with the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, is I've reached out to staff already specific to this issue, cognizant of today's date and those pressures that not only vehicle owners are facing, but pressures that service centres are facing, and certainly prepared to extend the date to the 1st of June, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate these circumstances. A couple of necessary steps, both regulatory and through my colleague in Department of Justice, appropriate to correspond with the law enforcement community to ensure that in the short term vehicle operators aren't impacted by enforcement. So those are the steps that we're prepared to take, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
I want to thank the Minister for that, because I know the local graduate that I talked to had spoken to the local police force, who allowed them to say they may, and they weren't sure. So I want to thank you for that, Mr. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, in the fishing industry, now more than ever, there is a need for innovation and cooperation. Mr. Speaker, several fishers applied to Ottawa to gain access to undeveloped species such as green crab, hagfish, quahogs, and Irish moss. These applications were denied. Mr. Speaker, due to the lack of scientific research. Last year, Nova Scotia was willing to partner with Ottawa to help fund this research. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, can the Minister give us an update on any progress made on behalf of fishers to fund the research and give them access to undeveloped species?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important topic to the fishing industry in Nova Scotia. I think the problem we've had in the past is we haven't really approached the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to find out exactly what science they need done. Because there's always a new species in the mix, and we want to make sure that we do the right science to convince them that, yes, it's a good process to go through. And we're in the process now of working with DFO to see if we can get that formula in place, because so many times when these things come forward, it's not clear exactly what DFO is looking for. So we're going to try to find out exactly what they're looking for so we can provide the valuable information that they need to ensure that we can get these species open, help the economy in Nova Scotia, and help indeed the long-term viability of the fishing industry as we move forward.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fishing industry employs thousands of Nova Scotians, many of which are seasonal employees. Mr. Speaker, providing harvesters with access to undeveloped species will help the industry diversify and supplement their incomes, which is already under attack with the federal EI reform, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, what action is this Liberal government taking to limit the impact of these EI reforms and protect the livelihood of people and the fishing industry in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries with 20 seconds.
Thank you very much. We're very deeply concerned about that change in the EI, and it's unfortunate the Conservative government in Ottawa has made this change. And as a result of that, there's going to be some hardships in the communities, and not only just in direct harvesting, it's also in the processing, where they're going to lose the workers.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired, and we'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, with the unanimous consent of the House, I would ask that the bills reported back from the Private and Local Bills Committee today be added to the order paper for consideration at Committee of the Whole and third reading.
Is it agreed? Agreed. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would move that you do now leave the chair and that the committee resolve itself into the House resolve itself into a Committee of the Whole on bills.
We'll now recess for 1 minute while we set up for Committee of the Whole House on bills.